Did you miss me? I have been so inactive here. I got really overwhelmed between grad school, full-time work, planning the wedding for the last several months. But I've had a bit of a slower period in the last few weeks, thank God. And I wanted to jump in and do a mid-year reading update on some of what I've been reading and some of my favorite takeaways from the last 6 months of reading. I have now read 51 books and about 20,000 pages in 2026, which is not terrible. So hopefully that will be of use and benefit to somebody out there through these videos. But without further ado, I want to jump in and talk about some of my favorite books and some of the books that have really made an impression on me this year. So far, my absolute favorite book of this year has to go to the Age of Madness series, which is a trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. I read these in like January, I want to say. And although I've read a ton of other 5-star reads that I'll get into and absolutely loved, this one remains undefeated to me. I think that like if my only takeaway from this year was this book series, it would still be a really good reading year. I'm delighted to have found this series. Joe Abercrombie has a very specific, strong writing voice, really strong characters, and kind of a funny writing style that I'm absolutely obsessed with personally. I feel like it's not corny, it's not overdone, but there is just kind of this dark humor throughout his books that helps maybe serve as a palate cleanser between these really violent and intense scenes. And I also feel like he writes with real intention and purpose, which I really enjoy. The Age of Madness series specifically has been a real highlight. We are following a large cast of characters, which does make it a little tough to get into. And we're set during almost like an industrial revolution equivalent. There are a lot of landholders, there are a lot of nobility, there is one king overall of the Union, and the lower classes are starting to rumble and revolt. So as the nobility is kind of playing its usual game of power plays and trying to win and curry favor and trying to decide who's on top, the lower classes are a major component in this story and are making some pretty drastic moves during this time period. This has been really interesting to read for me in the year of our Lord 2026, as I feel that wealth disparities and class political considerations are a major part of our discourse and should be a major part of our discourse. I feel there are many characters in this series who you should hate, and Joe Abercrombie, through sheer strength of writing and character construction, creates a redeemable, interesting, and compelling person at the heart of this, like, very unlikable figure in the society. So I found that was a really impressive magic trick from him. And we follow this really interesting like political and historical exploration of class warfare, revolutions, political upheaval, the challenges and failures of leadership at different levels. I just could not put these books down. They are large and they are worth the time. I also want to give a Best Book Award for a genre that I don't normally read. I just recently read Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zhang by Kylie Lee Baker. This story follows a young Asian American woman named Cora Zhang. She's living in New York City during the 2020 pandemic with her older sister Delilah when the two of them are in the subway one night and a man pushes Delilah in front of the subway train and kills her. This happens right in front of Cora. It obviously massively traumatizes and impacts her, and as she's kind of reeling in the wake of that, she becomes a crime scene cleaner, and she begins following the trail of like a series of similar hate crimes that are happening against Asian American women in the city. It's a tough read, I'll be honest. I don't normally read horror, and this book really reminded me why. It happened to be on nights that Caden, my fiance, was out of the house, and it was really unfortunate for me that I was reading a horror book on nights that I was home alone, but I literally could not put this down. Part of why I couldn't put this down was because I was in such suspense and like discomfort that I just wanted to get to the end of it and like have the catharsis of the ending. But I also just really was like captured by Cora. I felt that Kylie Lee Baker, for better or for worse, like really nailed what it felt like to be in the heart of the pandemic when like you really did not know when this was going to end, how it was going to end. There was so much caution and fear around other people and the fear of contamination. And then on top of that, I felt that she did a really great job of articulating just kind of this constant dread and building horror of what people are capable of as like these faceless perpetrators of hate crimes and like the fear of being hated. It was touching and moving, and it was also incredibly violent and gruesome. I wouldn't put this at the top of the list of books that like I would say characterize my reading taste, but it was fabulous nonetheless. I'm really glad that I picked it up, and I'm also glad at the end that I got to put it down. So that is Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zhang. New release that you haven't read yet, but you want to. I'm really excited about Shannon Chakraborty's new release, which is The Tapestry of Fate. This is the second book in the series that follows Amina al-Sarafi, or The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi. I read The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, I want to say in 2024, and I had a really fun time with it. We follow a retired pirate captain, Amina al-Sarafi, who is now in her middle age, like 40s, 50s. She has lived some life. She's got a lot of tales to tell, and she is ready to be done. She's excited to be back on dry land. She's raising her young daughter, and she just wants to be totally done with that whole life. But she's still got, this is part of who she is as a person, is this urge to be out on the open sea. So in the first book, when she gets kind of an offer that she literally can't refuse to get her crew back together and go on another seafaring adventure, she does head back out on the waves. I'm really excited to read Tapestry of Fate. I feel like these are great summertime reads too. There's something about the sea air and the found family of it all that's really fun. I would love to brush back up on what happened at the end of Amina al-Sarafi in the first place so that I can remember where I'm headed into in Tapestry of Fate. I thought there was also a really fun narrative device, which is that Amina al-Sarafi is telling her story to a little bard or a little teller of tales who doesn't get super well characterized, but every once in a while we will step back from the story and have a little funny exchange between the two of them where Amina al-Sarafi is really asserting her voice and her opinion over her story. So I really am excited about that book, which is already out. I think that came out in May. And then the new release that's coming out later in this year that I am rubbing my little hands together and can't wait to get in my hands is Hollywood Ending by John Green, which comes out on September 22nd. It finally has a cover, which he's very excited about and feels really kind of captures the story. My understanding is that this story follows two young adults as they are working on a biopic about Andy Warhol. I am so excited to get more of John Green's prose in my hands and in my brain. I have loved the nonfiction that he's come out with in the last several years. I loved Anthropocene Reviewed. I absolutely loved Everything is Tuberculosis. But I do feel like a John Green novel is such a classic, go-to reading experience for me from way back when. So I am so excited to get this in my hands, and I am confident that I'm going to love it. I know that writing and releasing a new book in particular is a very anxious experience for John. So I hope that this experience goes really well for him, and I'm so excited to cheerlead the book once it comes out. My number one biggest disappointment read this year was In the Woods by Tana French. I had been recommended this book many times as a quintessential thriller, a mystery that everybody loves. And for the first 45 to 50% of this book, I was inhaling it. I absolutely loved it. I loved Tana French's writing style. I didn't absolutely love our protagonist, but I was fascinated by him. I'm gonna give you the synopsis. I'll tell you a little bit more about what happened, and then I'll leave it up to anybody to decide how they feel about it or whether they want to go into the book. The basic story is that as a young boy, our protagonist, whose name is Rob Ryan, had two best friends in his neighborhood. He grew up in Knocknarea, which is a suburb of Dublin, and the summer that they were 12 years old, the three of them went into the woods to play, as they always did. Many hours later, their parents realized they were missing. The police went out and searched, and only Rob was found. When they found Rob, he was terrified. He had been kind of pushed himself back up against a tree. He had no memory of anything that happened, and his shoes were filled with blood. His friends were never found. So we have that mystery kind of bubbling under the surface of the entire book. Decades later, most of the book is following Rob, now as an adult and a detective on Dublin's murder squad, as he follows another murder of a 12-year-old girl. Her name is Katie. She was killed in Knocknarea. He's in this case not only to find justice for Katie and to give a resolution for Katie's family, but also because he's really hoping that he's going to find some connection and some clues and be able to pick back up the trail of the cold case about his best friends who died in the same woods. Now, what I found really frustrating about this book, and I guess this is a slight spoiler, but I think that this is an expectation that people should know going in, is that when you tell me you've written a thriller or a mystery, I feel like there should be a resolution in the book. It doesn't have to be a super clear-cut resolution, but there should be some answer. And I also feel like unless it is a fantasy thriller or a supernatural thriller like already told to me. I don't like when we just kind of put out there toward the end like maybe it was a supernatural monster. That feels like a huge cop-out to me. I don't know. Some answers do come in this book, okay? Fair enough. But if you are looking for, as I was, oh my gosh, this is so fascinating. Like, how are these connected? What the hell happened to his friends? Like, what's with the shoes? You know, all this kind of stuff. You're not gonna get any of that. I was more disappointed by this book than literally any other book that I've read. I was in a book slump for days because I wanted nothing more than to read the book I thought I had been reading. I didn't want to read anything other than the In the Woods I felt like Tana French owed me, which is very entitled and like is not accurate, but if I can spare one person from that feeling, I would love to. Onward to positive, because I have read so many great books this year. The biggest surprise for me was a book called Canticle, which was written by Janet Rich Edwards. We are following a young girl named Alice in Bruges in the 1400s, like the 13th century. Alice is born with just her whole life from when she's very young. She has this very close, intimate connection with God. She feels very compelled by her faith, and she decides to kind of commit herself further into the Catholic Church to pursue this love in her life. She joins the Franciscans, and because it was an all-male order at the time, instead of living in the monastery, she's sent to live with the Beguines, which I had never heard of before, but it's a community of women who are living together and doing a lot of like labor in the wool and textile trade together. They are faith-based, but they have not received holy orders. They can leave and get married, but they are committed to the faith in this community together. I found that element really fascinating. I really enjoyed not only this exploration of like faith and Alice as a character, but I also thought that as somebody who was like raised in the Catholic Church and has, as many people do, a very complicated relationship with the church as an adult, I really loved the way that this story captured some of the most beautiful elements of the Catholic Church, kind of the solidarity, the devotion, the way that it creates a community and a structure to help support people through some of the most difficult things that can happen in life. And then I also thought it did a good job of touching some of the ugliest elements of the church: abuse of power, greed, male chauvinism, and the gender dynamics. I thought that this was just beautifully done, and it was a really fascinating chunk of history that I had never seen anybody else explore before. So Canticle was a huge surprise to me. I picked it up not knowing what to expect, and I ended up feeling very moved by it. I have a new favorite author that I wanted to mention, which is Antonia Hodgson. I had never read anything by her before, and I do wonder, I think this might have been her debut novel, but I've mentioned before I read The Raven Scholar, which is like a huge chunky book, which I love. It had kind of like a mystery element and a fantasy competition element. I thought both were done very well and resolved very well. And then it also had a really fun sense of humor. I felt like Joe Abercrombie and Antonia Hodgson should hang out. All of these different factions are named after animals. Our protagonist is in the Raven faction. She's a scholar. Her name is Nima. And when the old emperor dies in this kingdom, every faction can put forward a champion who competes to become the next emperor, and through a weird contrivance of fate, Nima is both put forward as the Raven Scholar, like the champion for the Raven faction, and she also has to solve the murder of one of the contestants that had died right at the beginning of the competition. It's fascinating, it's fun. I did feel it lifted slightly from Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I enjoy also as a series, but I found some of the similarities between that and one of our characters really interesting. But all in all, great book, and I'm so excited to have Antonia Hodgson on my radar. If she could come out with another doorstop length book tomorrow, that would be great. I would appreciate it. I have a new fictional crush, which is not something I commonly have. I do read a lot of books with romance, but I don't really get attached to the men. But all of that changed for me when I read the Emma M. Lyon series by Beth Brower. This is such a fun series. There's 8 of them out. I listen to all of them on audiobook. They're relatively short, almost like novella length. Emma M. Lyon is a young orphan. She's returning to London to the house that she's going to inherit. It is inhabited currently by a very eccentric and annoying cousin of hers. She is kind of settling in throughout the series in her London neighborhood of St. Crispian's and like meeting all of these different characters. There's some like magical realism around St. Crispian's, and there are a ton of different like friends, foes, weirdos that like come into the books and out of the books. I loved Emma M. Lyon's perspective and her voice. She's really funny and opinionated. And then I also felt like this book series really scratched like two itches for me. If you're an Anne of Green Gables fan, like this is a very sweet, optimistic person who gets into a ton of like funny situations and has a really good sense of humor about it. And then also I felt like this had a little bit of the Jane Austen that I was looking for this spring as well. It is set, I don't know when, maybe the 1800s, so not as far back as Austen, but there is kind of that old-timey like Englishness to it, and there is a large cast of potential romantic interests that I'm hoping that Emma is going to work her way through. She has a good group of guys around her who are all very interesting and compelling. My personal crush is on Hawkes, the vicar, which, fine, whatever. I just talked about the Catholic Church then. I'll talk about, this is I think Anglican. Say what you will about me, but Hawkes is like this very mysterious, intelligent, semi-magical figure. He's a poet, and then there's an action scene in the 8th book that I'm not going to go into like a ton of detail about because I don't want to spoil anything, but he turned at that moment from like, oh, interesting character to like, bit of a crush for me. All I will say is that if you were a fan of Josh O'Connor's Father Judd portrayal in the Knives Out movie, the Wake Up Dead Man Knives Out movie, maybe that's a niche crush, but I had a crush on that guy, and Hawks the Fox really tied that together for me in this series. I cannot wait for the next one of those to come out. I need to stop picking up series that are still releasing because obviously I cannot handle when the books are not out yet, but I'm refreshing Beth Brower's blog on a regular basis, and I will let you know when I hear something. For my favorite fictional world of this year, I'm a huge fantasy reader, so I read a ton of different fictional worlds every year, but I have to give special shout out to the world created in Watermoon by Samantha Soto Yumbao. This book was so lush and beautiful. It felt like it was just like painted in watercolor almost. So the story follows Hana, a young woman in Japan who grew up in her father's pawn shop, and she learns her father's trade, which is to welcome in guests who wander through what they think is a ramen shop in regular Tokyo and wander into his magical pawn shop. He trades them for regrets, and those kind of manifest in like physical objects, but he like takes the regrets and the grieves of their lives and like restores to them some joy and comfort. There's some conversation in the book about like, is it ethical? Is it right? Is it beneficial to the clients to like lose these lessons that they've learned the hard way? But anyway, her father goes missing. Rando wanders in from the street, and she and this guy go on like this fantastical journey through Hana's world to try and find her dad. And Hana's world, I don't know that I would want to live in it, but I loved reading about it. She like travels through puddles. She travels through a rumor that is like going from person to person. She's able to like take a journey on the rumor to her next destination. They climbed clouds to sort of like a market that sold all sorts of crazy things. I just have never read a book that had this type of fantasy world. It just felt completely novel and fun. So that was a huge strength of this book. And on the strength of that, almost alone. I mean, there were other things that I really enjoyed. There were themes to pull out of this book for sure, but like, even if all you are looking for is like a type of fantasy that you haven't read before, this was fascinating, and I loved living there for a little bit. And then a book that made me cry, I'm an easy cry, but I just finished number 51 on my 51 books list, was Land by Maggie O'Farrell, which is a recent release. And I loved it. It is a historical fiction book. It follows the life of a cartographer and his family in Ireland. They are just one generation removed from the Great Hunger in the 1840s. So the cartographer Tomas and his wife both lived through the Great Hunger and lost their entire nuclear families to it. And the two of them are, in Irish fashion, very close-lipped about that. And the story primarily follows them and their young children, and Tomas's struggle with working for the British to feed his family. They have an encounter with a magical stream in a copse, and there's elements of magical realism throughout this book that I think were sort of a mixed bag in terms of success. Some of them really worked for me, some of them really didn't. But what I really loved about this book was the way that it followed a lot of the history of the people of Ireland through this one family. It follows kind of like the workhouses, the British feudal occupation and what that looked like. the relationship to the land in these more rural areas, the social relationship with the church again. I swear I'm not like, this isn't something I lie awake thinking about, but I guess it's something I read a lot about. And then it also talked about like the diaspora and the family kind of spreading out as the children get older. I just thought that this was so beautifully written. My entire family is like Irish American. A lot of this touched on things that, you know, family members of mine who grew up in Ireland have talked about and experienced. I just really loved reading it. I loved the family members and the characters, and also being a story about Irish people, pretty much every misfortune that could possibly be heaped upon a person happens to some member of this family at some point. So I was crying, I'll admit it. I mean, Maggie O'Farrell got me with Hamnet, and I think that movie got most people too. So we knew that she was going to be capable of this, but I really, really enjoyed it and found it very cathartic to read for the most part. And then I'm just going to do one last book, which is a book that made me happy. One of my most recent reads is a book called Joyful Anyway. It's nonfiction. It's by a woman named Kate Bowler, who is a theologian, I believe, at Duke University. She's written several books. This is the first of hers that I had read, but Kate spent her 30s dealing with a really serious cancer diagnosis, and there were many times that it seemed that she was going to die from this cancer. Fortunately, she is now in remission, but this book kind of explored, it was a self-exploration and reflection for her about how she personally reckons with the injustices and challenges of life and finds moments of joy anyway, to have a life that is joyful anyway. Even though she was not like prescribing things for the reader, as I was reading this and as she was kind of talking about like making time for herself to grieve moments that had been difficult, finding opportunities to like really savor the joy that she found in her life, I felt myself in my day-to-day life as I was listening to this on audiobook becoming more like intentional and thoughtful and present, and therefore being more open and receptive and appreciative of joy. I hope I get to hold on to that because I felt like that was such a stellar gift and a lovely takeaway from a book. So Joyful Anyway is a book I would really recommend, especially if you are dealing with something difficult or you're kind of done grieving something, but you're trying to reconcile how can life be so challenging and so beautiful. I felt this book did a really good job bringing those two things together. So I've read many other books, but I feel like if you had to get like a high level analysis of some of the best and some of the worst, this list really covers it. I am currently reading Daughter of Crows by Mark Lawrence, so I'm excited to do an update on that soon. And I'm almost done with How to Hide an Empire, which is a nonfiction book about the American colonial enterprise. I'm excited to be back and talking more about the books that I'm reading, and I hope everybody gets a good recommendation out of this if that's what you're looking for. Bye!